Good afternoon, my sweet children. I am missing you, but hope that you will enjoy as we continue to read our read aloud, Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. Now remember that before we start reading, good readers do a quick summary in their head to remind themselves of what's been going on in the story. So far in the story, Mrs. Frisby and her children live on the Fitzgibbon farm, and one of her sons, Timothy, has been very ill. He has been too ill to move from the winter home to their summer home in the woods, and their winter home is on the Fitzgibbon farms. The problem of the story is that Mr. Fitzgibbon is going to take his tractor and they're going to plow up the garden where Mrs. Frisby and her children live. Unfortunately, Timothy is not able to move quite yet, and so if they can't find a way to move him, bad things will happen. So Mrs. Frisby got some great advice from the wise owl that lived in the woods, and she has gone to meet the rats that live in the rosebush. She met a rat named Brutus and a rat named Justin, and they are taking her to meet Nicodemus. Although we have already read part of this chapter called In the Library, I'm going to start from the beginning so that we don't lose the meaning. So, here we go, In the Library. The tunnel led gently downward, and after the first dozen steps, they were in darkness. Mrs. Frisby could see nothing at all. Behind her, Mr. Ages limped along. Ahead, she could hear the shuffle of Justin's footsteps. She followed the sound blindly, and then she heard his voice. Just walk straight ahead, Mrs. Frisby. There's nothing to trip over and nothing to bump into. If you get off course, you'll feel the wall, he added. The dark part doesn't last long. Now, what did he mean by that? She thought it over for a minute or two as she walked and had decided to ask him when, to her surprise, she saw ahead of her a faint glow. A light! But how could there be a light down so far? There, we're through it, said Justin cheerfully. I know that blackout bit must be a bit annoying at first, but it's necessary. But aren't we underground? Oh, yes, about 3 feet down by now, I guess. Then how can it be light? I could tell you, Justin said, but if you'll wait 15 seconds, you'll see for yourself. In a few more steps in the tunnel, Mrs. Frisby could now see dimly the shape and direction took a turn to the right, and she did see for herself. She stopped in complete astonishment. Ahead of her stretched a long, well-lit hallway. Its ceilings and walls were a smoothly curved arch, its floor hard and flat, with a soft layer of carpet down the middle of it. The light came from the walls, where every foot or so on both sides a tiny light bulb had been recessed, and the hole in which it stood, like a little window, had been covered with a square of covered glass, blue, green, or yellow. The effect was that of stained glass windows in the sunlight. Justin was watching her and smiling. Do you like it? The carpet and the colored glass we didn't really need. Some of the wives did that on their very own, just for looks. They cut the glass, believe it or not, from old bottles. The carpet was a piece of trim they found somewhere. It's beautiful, said Mrs. Frisby. But how? Oh, well, we've had electricity for 4 years now. 5, said Mr. Ages. 5, said Justin agreeably. The lights, well, they were very small, very bright twinkling kind. We found them on trees. In fact, most of our lights come from trees. Not until after Christmas, of course. About New Year's. The big light bulbs we have had trouble handling. Mrs. Frisby was familiar with electricity. Her husband, who knew all kinds of things, had once explained it to her. At night she had seen the lamps shining in Mr. Fitzgibbon's house, and at Christmas time the lights that the sun strung on pine trees outside. It was like picking fruit, Justin said rather dreamily. the annual light bulb harvest. We had to go quite far up the road before we had enough. Even so, it took 2 Christmases. Justin, said Mr. Ages, I think we'd better get on. They continued along the hallway, which curved always slightly to the right so that Mrs. Frisby could never really tell how long it was, and which soon began to incline more steeply to the ground. Mrs. Frisby noticed that the air, which should have been dank and damp so far down beneath the ground, was only fresh and clean, and she thought she could even detect a very faint breeze blowing past her ears as she moved. In a moment the hall widened abruptly into a large oval chamber. Here the lights were set in the ceiling, and at the far end Mrs. Frisby could see the long tunnel continued and looked as if it slanted upward again, perhaps to another entrance, perhaps a back door. Was this then the destination, the main hall of all the rats? But if so, where were all the other rats? The room was entirely empty, and even there was not even a stick of furniture. A storeroom, said Justin, sometimes full, but now it's empty. Then she saw off one side of the chamber there was a stairway leading down, and beside it a small door. For freight only, he said, with a grin at Mr. Ages, who was limping. But considering your limp, Mr. Ages, I think we can make an exception, and instead of taking the stairs, this will be easier. Mrs. Frisby looked at the stairway. It went down in a spiral, and each step was neatly inlaid with a rectangular piece of slate rock. She could not tell how far down it led, since after the first turn of the spiral she could see no more, but she had a feeling that it was a long way down. As Justin said, it would be very hard for Mr. Ages. Justin opened the door. It led into a square room that looked like a closet. After you, he said to Mrs. Frisby. Mrs. Frisby went in, and the others followed, and the door swung shut. On the wall there were 2 knobs. Justin pushed one of them, and Mrs. Frisby, who had never been in an elevator before, gasped as she almost fell, and she felt the floor suddenly sink beneath her. Justin reached out a hand and steadied her. It's all right, he said. I should have warned you. But we're falling. Not quite. We're going down, but we've got 2 strong cables and an electric motor holding us. Still, Mrs. Frisby held her breath during the rest of the descent, until finally the small elevator came to a gentle stop, and Justin opened the door, and then she breathed again and looked out. The room before her was at least 3 times as big as the one that they had just left, and the hallways radiated from it as in as many directions as petals from a daisy. Directly opposite the elevator, an open arch led into what looked like a still larger room, seemingly some kind of an assembly hall, a meeting hall, for it had a raised platform at one end. And now there were rats. There were rats by the dozens, rats standing and talking in groups of 2s and 3s and 4s, rats walking slowly, rats hurrying, rats carrying papers. As Mrs. Frisby stepped from the elevator, it became obvious that strangers were a rarity down here, for the hubbub of a dozen conversations stopped abruptly, and all heads turned to look at her. They did not look hostile, as if she was an enemy, nor were they alarmed, since her 2 companions were familiar to them, but they were simply curious. Then, as quickly as it had died out, the sound of talking began again, as if the rats were too polite to stand and stare. But one of them, a lean rat with a scarred face, left his group and walked toward them. Justin, Mr. Ages, and I see we have a guest. He spoke graciously, with an air of quiet dignity, and Mrs. Frisby noticed 2 more things about him. First, the scar on his face ran across his left eye, and over his eye he wore a black patch fastened by a cord around his head. Second, he carried a satchel, kind of like a bag or a handbag, by a strap over his shoulder. A guest whose name you will recognize, said Justin. She is Mrs. Jonathan Frisby. Mrs. Frisby, this is Nicodemus. Oh, a name I recognize indeed, said the rat. Called Nicodemus. Mrs. Frisby, are you perhaps aware of this? Your late husband was one of our greatest friends. You are always welcome here. Oh, thank you, said Mrs. Frisby, but she was more puzzled than ever. In fact, I did not know that you knew my husband, but I'm glad to hear of it because I've come to ask your help. Mrs. Frisby has a problem, said Mr. Ages, a very urgent problem. Well, if we can help you, we will, said Nicodemus. He asked Mr. Ages, can it wait until after the meeting, about an hour or so? We were just ready to begin. Mr. Ages considered. Well, an hour will make no difference, I think. Nicodemus said, Justin, show Mrs. Frisby to the library where she can be comfortable until the meeting is over. Now by this time the last of the other assembled rats had made their way into the large meeting hall, where they sat facing the raised platform. Nicodemus followed them, pulling some papers and a small reading glass from his satchel at the side as he walked up to the front of the room. Justin led Mrs. Frisby into another direction, down a hallway to the left, and again she had the impression of a faint, cool breeze against her face. She realized that the corridor or hallway that she had walked in was already just merely an entranceway, and that the halls around her were where the rats really did live. Those were their homes. The one down which Justin led her was lined with doors, one which he opened. In here, he said. The room they entered was big, square, well lit, and had a faint, musty smell. It's reasonably comfortable, and if you like to read, he gestured at the walls. They were lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, and on the shelves stood, Mrs. Frisby dredged in her memory, books, she said. They're books. Why, yes, said Justin. Do you read much? Oh, only a little, said Mrs. Frisby. My husband taught me, and the children. She started to tell him how hard it was scratching the letters in the earth with a stick. It seemed so long ago that Mr. Frisby had taught them, but Justin was leaving now. Oh, excuse me. I've got to go to the meeting. I hate meetings, but this one's important. We're finishing up the schedule for the plan. He announced it with a real capital P, the plan. But he was out the door, closing it gently behind him, and Mrs. Frisby looked around her. The room, the library, Nicodemus had called it, had, in addition to its shelves of books, several tables and benches beside them, and on these were stacks more of books. Some of them were open. Books. Her husband Jonathan had told her all about them. He had taught her and the children to read. The children had mastered it quickly, but she herself could barely manage the simplest of words. She had thought perhaps it was because she was older. He had also told her about electricity. He had known these things, and so it emerged did the rats. It had never occurred to her until now to wonder how he knew them. He had always known so many things, and she had accepted that as just a matter of fact. But who had taught Mr. Frisby those things? Who had taught him how to read? Strangely, it also emerged that he had known the rats. Had they taught him? What was their connection? She remembered his long visits with Mr. Ages, and Mr. Ages knew the rats too. Was that the connection? She sighed. Perhaps when the meeting was over and she had had a chance to talk to Nicodemus and had told him about Timothy and the moving day, perhaps then, when that was settled, he could explain to her all of the things that she was wondering about. She noticed at the far end of the room a section of the wall where there were no bookshelves. There was instead a blackboard covered with words and numbers written in white chalk. There were pieces of chalk and an eraser in a rack at the bottom of it. The blackboard stood near the end of the longest of the tables. Was the library also used as a classroom? Hmm. When she looked at the blackboard and rather laboriously read what was written on it, she saw that it was not. It was rather not a classroom, but a conference room. And at the top of the board, in letters, were printed the words, "The Plan of the Rats of NIMH." And that is the end of the chapter, The Library. So now that we have finished reading, I am wondering if you could write me a quick prediction of what you think the plan of the Rats of NIMH is. Make sure and use information from the text to support your prediction. I can't wait to hear what you think. And tomorrow, the chapter is called Isabel. Have a great day. I miss you all dearly.